Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Sound and Music panel. My name is Corey Stillman. I'm a publicist with Impact 24 PR, as well as a journalist with bylines at IndieWire, Polygon, and Awards Radar. I'm really excited to be speaking with a really talented group of creatives today about a really fun batch of projects and how sound and music combine for the final product. So please join me in welcoming all of them to this virtual stage. First, we have sound mixer of highest to lowest, Allison Jackson.
Hi, happy
We
to be
have
here.
award-winning film and television composer Philip Guyler,
Hello.
composer on A Winter Song, Armand Aloyan, and founder of Aquarium Studios as well as sound designer of such films as Conclave and About of a Small Player, Ben Baird.
Hi.
Yeah, so thanks again for joining me, everybody. Really excited for this chat today. And I want to start with kind of a general question for everyone because we're talking about two very interlinked things here, obviously, in sound and music. But I'm curious, at what point in a project do you feel collaboration is most crucial for those two segments, for sound and music? And maybe kind of, which department do you most want to be in conversation with at that stage? And Allison, it's all right. I want to start with you because I do feel the highest to lowest has, a really fascinating relationship with, its score and diegetic music and all kinds of things. So, yeah, I'm curious everybody's thoughts. But let's start with you, Allison.
Yeah, it depends on the film, honestly. Like if the film is not music heavy, sound mixer, on-set sound mixer and music folks don't usually talk that often. But for highest to lowest, those conversations happen during pre-production, particularly with the Eddie Palmieri band. Like that was a huge scene, and we wanted to make sure we got that recorded as best we could because we only had him for a certain amount of time over 2 days, I believe. But it was like a 4 hour block, so we wanted to make sure we got everything recorded well. And then the final song in the film, which was the singer playing singing with a piano accompaniment, and that was all recorded live. So we were in contact not during pre-production, but as soon as production started, we were having conversations. Myself, Spike, and the music director of that show. We're talking about which mics we were using, how we wanted to record it, how often we'd be recording it, whether or not we wanted someone there to do playback. So we're recording this track live, but also simultaneously recording it to another playback person's gear so that if anyone got tired, whether the pianist or the vocalist got tired, they could just play it back through earwigs and have that as a backup track. We didn't end up using it. We did everything live, but those conversations were happening right from the beginning.
Very cool. Let's hear from our other sound designer on this, Ben.
Well, I think so. The collaboration between sound and music kind of is up to the director. So, in some films, sort of you have a conversation with the director very, very early on, and then the idea of maybe introducing, talking with the composer, and sort of start making a plan of how sound design would work with the music can happen in some stages. With some films, it's the music arrives as a sort of pre-finished block at the very end for the mix. There's a very interesting when we did the film Lady Macbeth about it must be over 10 years ago now. Was a meeting between me and the composer and the director, and the outcome of that meeting was in fact to not have any music in the film at all. Which was sort of, I mean, that sounds like it could be quite amusing, but actually Dan then joined us on the sound design team, and actually it was very interesting sort of to have a musical ear on how sound could work. But in fact, and actually there was a little bit of score. There's one note that comes in at three crucial points. I think sort of that was something that was decided in the cafe before even the filming had begun. Whereas something like Ballad of a Small Player, sort of Volker turned up with the score more or less complete. But we did have conversations at various stages during the edit where he would actually give me little bits and pieces that we could blend into the sound, so an instrument that we could blend into the sound of a bird for where a scene when he wakes up the next morning and something mysterious has happened, but we don't know. So, it's like you do sort of build relationships. The first film that we did with Volker, sort of everyone was working in their separate departments. Then there's more conversation. But I think these are sort of very much, how the director feels they want to make their film. And I think that as time moves on, bringing sound in earlier is something that more and more people are getting, interested in. I think so. In the past, sound was very much a technical operation, whereas now it's actually part of the same thing that the music goes into, which is your ears and into your brain, and has many opportunities to tell the story. So people are becoming more and more interested in sort of introducing the conversations earlier on. But it is very much, I think, it's very easy to sort of sort of have your department and you very much want to do your thing, and not be sort of like, well, they're the enemy because they're making noise at the same time we're making noise, and you realize, no, we have to learn a different way of doing things, and I think we are, and directors are encouraging that to happen.
Yeah, I like your framing there of like they're making noise and we're making noise. And so like, I'm curious, Philip and Armand, like when, when composing your scores, again, the same question of what is this collaboration like with sound? And have there been moments maybe where you've thought of scores similarly to what Ben described, where you're like, ooh, this would pair well with this sound cue or this moment here, this moment there. Yeah, again, just generally tell us about that kind of collaboration in your mind.
Absolutely. For a project like Winter Song, it's essentially a musical. Not a musical in the sense of like cheer, haha, singing along, but there's a lot of music in the film, both original that I composed and also just from the past that they decided to place. In addition to the soundtrack. So in that sense, being brought on early is really important for that kind of project. And I was brought on about 2 years before they start filming, basically in script stages. Uh, in order for us to just be as prepared as we can when we do get to the set and it is time for production. You want to have that sync ready to go. You want to have all the songs done. And so that's just a really fun thing for me. I hadn't been, I've worked on projects where I make the soundtrack before, but to also be able to create the music for the film, the songs, that was really fun. And having that preparation and just working with our lead actress, Krista Marina, who's an amazing singer. The movie kind of revolves around her, and we sculpted the sound for that film and for the main song that she eventually gets to in the end as she discovers herself, to perform that. And so I would say for this kind of project, it was awesome to be able to do that.
Totally. And Philip, I'm curious your thoughts as well.
Um, yeah, I would say as normally it's not it's a case of the music's and the sound are done separately and then they're brought together in the edit. So often I'm found I'm working not conversing with any sound designers at all. It's only if it's been necessary to do it. There's like I remember working on a science fiction show and the noise of the robots they wanted incorporated into the music. So that's when I directly collaborated with the sound designer so I could get those sounds and incorporate them into the score of the music. But most of the time, the music's done, the sound's done, and they're brought together in the edit. And then it's often during the edit, if there's something that needs enhancing by a sound effect or music enhancing that, then you'd often hear from the editor or the director that would come back and say, we need to make these things work together. So that would be a sort of opportunity to collaborate. But certainly the norm is I tend to find the two things are very separate and then only brought together in the edit at the end.
Yeah, that makes total sense, which is why I'm so curious about this panel, is because I do find that that it's interesting to bring you folks together and just kind of get a sense of how your work does gel, whether it's during post production or months later as we kind of reflect. So I want to go back to Allison here because highest to lowest has, I mentioned this earlier, like a very layered soundscape, like diegetic music, score, a lot of just like complex kind of ambient background noise. And so when recording, we add dialogue to that mix. When recording dialogue over these sort of complex backgrounds, what techniques do you use to preserve emotional nuance without sacrificing any clarity?
It's kind of just trying to make the scene as quiet as possible. I mean, shooting on the streets of New York, which most of this of High Slows took place in, can be tricky. Um, when you're shooting exterior, it's kind of just like timing, working with the AD department, saying, "Hey, can we only film when there's a red light here and a green light there, so the traffic moving is further away," without kind of pausing too much, so actors have time to. You don't want actors to have too much downtime in between takes. So it's just sort of talking with other departments, especially the AD department in that situation, to see if we can sort of get what we need without stepping on too many people's toes. I mean, other than that, it's microphone choice. There are some microphones that are more directional and can really block out the extraneous noise. It's quieting folks in the background, whether that's putting little plastic caps on people's shoes or laying carpets when we can. Carpets not so much outside, but for interior noisy locations, it's kind of I don't know, working in the background and doing things quickly and quieting as much as you have control over, and the other stuff you sort of just have to let go and hope for the best.
Totally, and I imagine there's nice surprises that come from that as well. It's
Oh,
just
sure, because
hoping for
you'll
the
scout a
best and
location on one day and then you're actually there for the shoot and there's construction happening that wasn't there when you
right.
scouted it 3 weeks ago. So,
And I'd imagine, yeah, I'd imagine Spike's the kind of director that maybe appreciates a little bit of that New York chaos, but of course, clarity and making sure you can hear everything is going to be paramount. So, that's all very interesting. The caps on people's shoes and whatnot. I'm going to hop back over to you, Philip. So this is again a little bit more on the music and scoring side. So I know you've scored for documentary themes, dramas, just big orchestral scores, and so when recording with like the London Philharmonic or some of these major orchestras, that's obviously a very traditional kind of instrumentation. But I know you've scored for a variety of modern projects as well. And so how do you sort of bridge that gap between what we think of as very classic traditional orchestral scores and maybe more contemporary modern storytelling needs? Like, what is your maybe guiding philosophy when you think about scoring in that way?
I think a thing that I do a lot is, so if I'm doing something with an orchestra, so it might be strings and brass and piano and things like that, we'll bring in contemporary elements. So there might be electronic percussion, some synths, electronic bass in there. So it sort of balances it out and gives us that almost like that hybrid feel, which is very common in film. If you look at the work of Hans Zimmer and things like that, it's bringing those two elements together. So it does give it sort of brings it into the modern day, but keeping that sort of traditional sound there also gives it a sort of a timeless quality. And also, I think if you've got a score that's heavily sampled, it doesn't hold up as well as an orchestral score. They've almost got a timeless quality to them. So adding in those sort of modern contemporary elements just helps it keep it up to date and contemporary.
Totally, yeah. Yeah. So this next question is for everyone, and I do kind of want to circle back on some like what you mentioned there. When I have another question for Armand in a little bit, but this next one is I'm curious because again we're here talking about sound and music. We're talking about how your roles relate to one another, and something that I've been kind of curious about in this world is like, can you think of a moment on a project where maybe you ever felt the need to sort of like be resist your own tendencies, maybe kind of pull back on your specific role. Maybe you are obviously are advocating for the soundscape, you're advocating for the music, but maybe there was a moment where you felt, you know what, actually it's important that I let the music dominate this moment, or I pull back on the score and I allow the sound to kind of take the forefront here. Again, I'd like to start with anybody here. Maybe we can stick with you, Philip, if you can even think of a moment where you can either let the sound of the music come through more in a given moment.
Well, that's interesting actually, because this has happened a few times, but I'll go back to like I was doing some crime sort of feature, and it was a case that there was a lot of music in, and the director said, "Oh, so we've gone really, we've built up now. Now we need to bring it down." And da, da, da. And I said, "Well, do we need to have music in this scene at all?" I think there's sometimes, especially nowadays, there's this thing that we've got to have music there all the time. And sometimes it's not necessary. It's just this thing that, oh, well, we must have something there, where often having nothing can be have more of a dramatic effect than having music. Sometimes just having nothing. So then when the music comes back in, it's got more of it hits more, it's got more of feeling rather than it just being wallpaper that's there all the time. So certainly on a few projects recently, I've been saying, well, do we need to have it there? Let's just give it some space. Let's have nothing. So when the music comes back in, it feels like it's got more of an impact. It's noticeable because it's not just been a wallpaper in the background through the entire thing.
Yeah, Armand, do you have any thoughts on that as a composer as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree with what Philip said. Silence can be an instrument too if it's used correctly. I've had a lot of instances where I kind of have to pull back just because I love the aspect of scoring. I love adding music, but sometimes it's difficult. You kind of have to sit down with yourself and with the director and the important decision makers and be like, which scenes really need it and which scenes do I need to pull back? Because I can write all day, but I've also had the issue sometimes of just having it clash. And so it's a tough learning process, but like that's part of the job, right? If you're not able to, you almost want it to be important, but not too important. So it's easier said than done. But those are the best soundtracks. You know, they both stand on their own and they also blend really well in between dialogue scenes. And we had a lot of that in the Winter Song. You know, there's a lot of dialogue scenes, but the emotions are super necessary, and I try guiding that, but obviously not being too on the nose, being a romantic comedy. And so I think that's just a fun balance that we play with, and when you get it right, it's extremely satisfying.
Yeah, I think part of what I find so fascinating about composers and about your line of work is that idea that it has to both stand on its own and coexist alongside things like dialogue and sound and all these other things. And so yeah, it is a really impressive balance, and I yeah, very much admire it for that reason. Allison, I want to go back to you in highest to lowest because again, I'm thinking about a film that has a lot of score in it. You know, it has a lot of different sound. Like we keep talking about how it is this very complex, sort of layered film. But yeah, can you just think of moments where you still felt you had to either pull back on one or the other in order to allow the appropriate sound come through?
Yeah, it's a little different because I'm recording everything on set, so there's no music there for me to be like,
There.
oh, this is where the music will come in. Um, as Philip said, that kind of happens later. But there will be moments where, Spike would come up and be like, "This is going to be a montage. We don't need audio here." And those are times where I'm like, "Okay, you have a vision. I will. I'm still going to record because I can't not record if they were actors, but we won't fight to have the boom like right here. We'll just put the mic in the room, just get some ambience and call it a day." And so it's unless I'm told directly, I will fight for every shot to get good, clean audio. But I'm happy to step back when the director is clear on what they have in mind.
Yeah, Ben, what about you?
Yeah, it's very interesting because I think I would say my answer is very similar to the our composer friends here because I mean I come from a background, a musical background, and a music editor is how I started, sort of 30 years ago. But actually now as the sound designer, you're often I'm the mixer often as the final mixer of the film, and so it's that in that process where there's you and the director finishing it. And I mean, many years ago, you start sort of exactly what you're saying. They're saying, well, maybe now that there's all these other things in, we don't need to have the music going all the way through. But of course, I don't know whether I'm making that judgment based on because actually it's hiding some of my lovely sound or because there's a genuine feeling. So I've spent, sort of 20 years really learning and working with people so that actually I can be as dispassionate about removing a sound, a word, or a piece of music, or suggesting it. I mean, as this sounds like I'm making something, it's sometimes you're sitting there and you've got a director and an editor who are very close to the film, and what you want to say is, you know what, it'd be best if you didn't have anything here at all, and to be able to say that with a kind of integrity, it has to mean that I've sort of within myself, I've got rid of my desire to have the lovely sound effects of someone tying a knot or whatever, as well. So I think it's sort of that's what I've had to pull back on is the actual love of the sound that I'm doing, because actually, in the same way as actors don't come into the final mix and say, "Hoi, where's the line that I said?" or "We cut that scene out." Well, in the same way as someone's got to sort of be an arbitrator in sort of the deciding of what things come in. So I think that's what I've pulling back on my own sort of history of making sound to be able to help in the judgment and to have an opinion that is valid. And consequently, I know, so I mean, I work with a lot of composers. I have very good relationships with them, especially so there's a few series that I've been working on for a long time. And actually, we sort of would discuss that, when I finish with this, there's going to be a heap load of other things in this scene. So perhaps you don't need to worry about scoring that. And they would come back and say, yeah, good idea, we won't. And actually, sort of, you realize that, of course, because in the edit, the piece of music goes in, it stays in, it becomes part of what everyone's used to. And then when all the car chase sounds appear, actually, you could have a more visceral thing by not having the music there if you wanted. But everyone's so used to the music being there that it sort of stays there. And so I just like to put myself in the position to be able to ask that question. And also to be able to take absolutely on the chin, like, that stuff that you did that was beautiful and it took you 6 months to record and you traveled around the world doing it. Well, it's not for this film, so can we take it away, please? And absolutely understand and go along with that. So again, these are all everything's director led, really. And I think it's sort of about getting in behind, so the vision, trying to get into understand a language that you create with the director that allows them to tell you their vision, and then you allow them to give them back what they're looking for. Is the whole thing really?
Yeah, it's a super interesting answer because it sounds like to me like your background has really allowed you to be a sort of trusted authority on these kind of things and allow different department heads and creatives to really trust your perspective on this because I think of a film like Conclave, and that's to me it sounds is a film that is like super well balanced between these elements we're talking about. I mean, you have this very iconic Volker Bittelman score that can be very like loud and sort of like oppressive on the scene at times. But then, honestly, a lot of my lasting memories of that film are moments of quietude and just kind of the echoey, sort of like, like, yeah, the echoey halls of the of Vatican. So I'm curious, because Allison was obviously talking about the unique challenges of being on set, making sure you have the right microphones and you're recording this and, blocking out this noise and that. So obviously, I understand that, a lot of your work is coming on the post-production side, but is Aquarium maybe just help us understand kind of the process on these kinds of films. Is Aquarium involved with a film like Conclave from the production point where you are, you're making sure that the microphones are set up the way you want them to be and all those different things that you're able to kind of help yourself later by being involved with the sound during the production phase?
Sometimes I think it's sort of again, so there's been some films where you're not even been employed until they've got into the edit suite. So all of that has happened, and then other times, like sort of Edward Berger, we now talk about the film before he shoots stuff, but it's only just a conversation. It's not like an hours and hours of I've done all this research and have a look at it. And so so I think when we did Disobedience, because there was a lot of stuff being filmed in sort of large religious environments, synagogues and churches and halls like that, and Sebastian Velio was very keen to get the performance and keep the performance. So we did sort of have conversations with, I could remember his name in a minute, that's terrible. A great conversation. And actually, I went to the set a couple of times, and actually, I learned more about what I'm getting than they, so what they delivered, what he delivered was absolutely perfect, and is actually me understanding. So I didn't have a casual attitude towards the difficulties that some situations, especially when you have 300 people who suddenly stand up while someone's speaking, you've got this huge amount of noise that suddenly appears, and you realize, oh, okay, I understand how that. And in fact, now that I understand and see and feel it, actually, that's an energy to use. So I think sort of I love having conversations with all departments. It's just sometimes sometimes you just the process doesn't allow it, but when it does, it's absolutely so fantastic. Most of the time, because I mean, I think everyone would probably agree that most of it is research. You work on something, you got an idea, you try and tell a story, you research and you work, and part of the research and work is talking to people. And one of the beautiful things, best thing ever about Conclave is they actually sent me to Rome to go and just listen to what the Vatican's like. I mean, crikey O'Reilly. I also had an extremely good lunch. And I think that so yeah, it's all of that, all of those elements come into it. So every conversation is valid and useful and will always add. But sometimes it's difficult. Sometimes they're shooting in a different a country in a different time zone. I can't go and visit them. Or often, sort of like a circumstance, a political thing has happened, and suddenly, it's like I'm appearing on the film, and I wasn't there until the very end. So it's variation. But again, all director led. Really, it's really just of getting behind that person. But yeah, studying, research, working. I don't know whether I actually answered your question. I think sort of this things. My parents were music teachers. I think it's sort of that. That's why I've got this ability to tell long stories.
That was great, and I think we all probably want to hear more about that lunch at some point. Maybe that can be
Yeah,
after our panel here today. Um,
yeah.
Armand, I want to jump back to you because you talked about how A Winter Song obviously has a lot of original music in it as well. And so I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit more about the collaboration with the on-screen performers, with the directors, and sort of shaping the overall musical identity as well as maybe some of those individual musical numbers in a project like A Winter Song. And I'm curious, obviously, from like a professional collaboration standpoint, but even if you could maybe touch on the fact that this is obviously a film very steeped in like Armenian identity and culture, I would imagine that a lot of that collaboration was even more vital. So yeah, just I'm curious your thoughts.
Exactly, yeah. we get to include that culture in that movie, and that makes it so special. You know, me being Armenian and the film being filmed in our homeland. It was the first rom-com in the English language that's filmed there, so that's really special. The collaboration aspect of it, even the director, who's not necessarily musical, but she had like a good taste and good idea of what she wanted, from that main song that we collaborated with Krista, our lead actress, on. Uh, she she kind of knew what she wanted, and we sort of did it, and then this is why this goes ties back into the question you had earlier, which is like it was so important to be involved early because we thought we had it, and then we were like, she was like, actually, no, I think we need to do a different direction. And the song was like almost finished. So we're like, all right, that's no problem because we have the time. So we were able to kind of hone that in and take a little bit of a different musical direction. But it's having those conversations, it's being prepared. This wasn't a big budget film by no means, so most of it was done in the box. Just me and my keyboards and all my accessories that I have in my little cozy studio here. But we were able to bring a few small musicians. The film being Armenian itself, I really wanted to include like kanon, and oud, all these Middle Eastern instruments, that give it the correct flavor, and it fits in a lot of the scenes. There's a scene where they're kind of just traveling to one of this like really famous restaurant, and I think that soundtrack really just makes you feel like you're in Armenia, and that was definitely the goal. Um, and so I would say it's really important, working with that idea and having the culture and all that stuff in mind.
Chris, would you tell us a little bit more maybe how you got involved with the project? I mean, obviously, as an Armenian composer, this in some ways sounds like the dream project, right? So, yeah, just
Definitely.
tell us how it found you or how you found it.
Yeah, I mean, not only me, but for all most of the cast and crew being Armenian, it was filled with our people, and I think that's really special. I got involved through multiple people. The met the director through the other lead actress, Edgar, and I sent her like one or two demos. I always try and include more than less. I think it was like 5 minutes. Just the music that I thought I didn't even ask, right? It was almost like an audition, and she loved it. She's like, "Yeah, this is great." And so that worked.
Very cool. Well, I just kind of have one last question, honestly, but this one's for everyone, so maybe we can kind of, turn this into a mini conversation unto itself. So, we talked a little bit earlier about maybe a moment where you've had to kind of pull back one way or another, but I almost want to ask the inverse here is, what's maybe one choice that you've made in any of the projects that we've discussed here today that maybe audiences would not consciously notice, but that you believe significantly improved the final experience? I imagine for sound designers, this is like maybe like the dream question because I gotta imagine this kind of stuff is happening all the time. It's often the things you don't hear, right? Or maybe a very subtle sound that only you hear as the person who managed to record it or edit it in. But composers, I imagine there's cues that you're really proud of that are very personal or maybe more recognizable to you. So when I ask that question about kind of one choice that audiences might not notice but that you're proud of, does anything come to mind? And maybe I'll start with you, Philip.
Yeah, I think I always try and be as authentic as I can with things. So I did like an electronic score a while back, and it would have been so easy just to do that all in the box. But I've got quite a lot of old analog synthesizers, some very rare ones. So I really made a point of incorporating those into the soundtrack because I don't know, yeah, they probably won't notice a lot of difference, but for me, you can certainly tell a difference when you're using sort of real electronic instruments rather than samples in the box. They've got a much warmer sound, a deeper sound, and also I've got to listen to that. That I've created that soundtrack. I'll be listening to it for years to come, so I can go back to it and think, yeah, I was authentic as I could with that. I tried to make it as genuine as possible. And also similar instances where I've been working on things where there's been very little budget, but I thought, I brought in sort of featured soloists, maybe cello or something like that, even if it's on the underscore, so it's not that noticeable if it's got dialogue over it. But I'll still, if it's a solo instrument, I'll always try and use a real player rather than a sample, because again, if I listen back to it 6 months later or whatever in isolation, I'm thinking, oh, I should have put that there. It's just that thing for you because as a converter, you're obviously very proud of what you want, or you want to be proud of what you've done. So you want to listen back and I made the best job I possibly could of that. And so to me, that's sort of trying to be authentic in a little bit of a way, you know?
It's cool.
Yeah. Yeah, Ben, your thoughts. Yeah, I mean, authenticity I know is such a key part of what we're doing here. But yeah, I'm Ben, I'm curious. Give an example.
Yeah, I mean, I think that probably the technical choice I discovered, I tried probably 2007 on a film on the World Trade Center, which was absolutely complete and utter silence, and realizing that the power that absolute silence has on an audience, especially in the cinema, not so much on telly, is well, I mean, obviously that one ruined everyone's evening because it sort of I was just almost too strong. And I think sort of many films, I don't look, I don't always have silence as some kind of, sort of watchword, but I do look for where the opportunities to have, where would be the highest point in the film, and often that point being in silence is actually quite effective. Then again, when we did Lady Macbeth, I think that was sort of like a perfect sort of experiment on using, sort of basically Florence Pugh's inside this house and she's kind of imprisoned there, and it's absolutely completely silent. And then you'd have a tiny, tiny noise, and it's a pin drop, and you realise that when I watched in the cinema, oh, no one ate their popcorn for that scene. And you realize,
Mm.
oh, that is having an effect on the audience, a direct effect on the audience. They don't know it. They're not sitting there, just, you're exposed. So I think that that's probably the thing that I've learnt, sort of, and obviously trying not to use it as a gimmick, but obviously in Conclave, it's when he breaks into the Pope's room, and the door closes, it drops to absolutely nothing. It's not like a hum or something gently going on that's a sort of perceived silence. It's actually nothing for a moment, and I find that suddenly, as an audience member, you're aware of your own breathing, you're aware of your own thing, and actually that emotional response is probably the most powerful thing that from a sound design you can do, especially like as you say, it's musical because absence of sound is as musical as music, because it's part of the rhythm of life. You go in the morning and a perfect sort of like windless morning, and then there's one bird, and you realize there's one tweet, and then the rest of it is a complete peace, complete silence. You think, right, okay, that's a very sort of a very powerful, natural sort of sensation. So I think that's probably to answer, so that's the one big thing that I learned from this World Trade Center film, and also I think a film in the tsunami. I think there's also it's interesting. I probably should have talked about it a bit more. A film we did about then 2006 called War Oratorio, which was sort of the marriage of a piece of music that was specifically written as for a story of a British soldier in Afghanistan, a someone who was kidnapped by the Lord's Army in Uganda, and someone whose son was killed in a car bomb in Kashmir. And this sort of like the fact that the marriage of how the sound of when the choir starts singing and the libretto is literally the words, the tick 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 of a bomb, and you're sitting there thinking, right, to me, it's like usually it's in Italian or whatever, and they're singing an opera, and you have no idea. Suddenly, these are words I understood, and then married with this very powerful, quite contemporary score, and then the sound of so like a fighter jet plane, all interwoven together. I thought was so that was also I think, and we were talking. I mean, I should have probably mentioned this earlier on because it sort of just came to me. We were talking to the composer and the director for 2-3 years beforehand. It wasn't a high budget thing, so it wasn't. This is all about how we're going to save the money to get this effectively done. But it was, I think, sort of one of the first awards that we won. And again, that was because again, this is the work, the research, the collaboration. These are all not just lip service; they're real things. When you actually do it, sort of magic really comes about. But yes, but the technical thing that I did is probably the silence that
Yeah.
I've learned. I've always bear that in mind. I mean, I think sort of there's sort of like I think it's like in a matter of life and death. It's not like I'm new, but when the bloke who smells of onions appears, all sound drops out, and they do it the best they can. Obviously, they've got optical soundtracks, hisses and bumps to get round, but they do that. And I remember actually being quite struck by that as a kid. And of course, 2001 has beautiful silence when he goes out into space. So it's not like I've invented something. It's just when I discovered it, you realize, oh, that's important for me.
Yeah. And those are all great examples. I'm glad that that last project you mentioned, came to your mind right before we wrapped up here. Because yeah, that's a great example. And I think you brought up a good point about how silence has a musicality to it as well. And I think I think about a film like Conclave once again. Like the reason that silence hits as hard is that it kind of elevates the score the same way the score elevates that silence. It's I think it's a testament to this panel we're doing here today and bringing you folks together is that whether you're in communication or not, like the odds are is that your work is uplifting one another's. And so, with that in mind, Armand, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on the composer side of things.
Yeah, definitely. I love kind of doing what you asked, which is finding ways to put in little Easter eggs or things that maybe I notice and hopefully a few others catch on, but it's not definitely obvious. Like on a few action cues, I'll if there's a drum or beat, I'll try and tap or do anything I can human-esque to add this, like even on an acoustic guitar, like using it in unorthodox ways really helps make it yours, makes it unique. And samples are great, but everyone has access. There's chances are what samples that I'm using, a lot of the other composers are using as well. And so anything that you can do as a composer to stand out and to make it be different and be like, no one can recreate that except for me, is something that you should be proud of. And I definitely take pride in that for sure. And not so much on Winter Song, but definitely on a lot of other projects where I've just tried and done these weird little things that you won't necessarily notice, or even like in another action project, like putting the sounds of a reversing truck in the cue itself. You won't necessarily hear it, but if I soloed it, you'd be like, wow, that fits in perfectly. And finding moments like that to make it special and stand out, but obviously I wouldn't want it to be noticeable.
Yeah, that's super cool. And yeah, it's if you're listening for it, like it's like just thinking outside the box to have the idea of a reversing truck and letting out some musicality is super cool. What project is that in? Just so we can keep an eye out for it if any of us were to watch.
Oh, this was years ago. It hasn't came out. It was
Oh,
like a
okay.
small indie project. Yeah.
All right. Well, hey, let us know if it ever does, 'cause I want to
Yeah.
keep an ear out for that reversing truck. Allison, finish us off on this question. I'm curious your thoughts on that particular
Yeah, it's a
choice.
little different for me because I essentially record the tracks on set and then I give everything to post production and it's completely out of my hands. So I can't
Right.
really put a stamp on something or put a little Easter egg in there. But I guess it's kind of a an overarching goal I set for myself in terms of recording the crispest, cleanest dialogue tracks possible. So there's very little, if any, ADR. Because I feel like, I mean, because my ears are tuned to it, I can always tell, but I'm like, oh, everyone can tell. ADR is horrible. So I always strive to get the crispest dialogue possible. And then the other thing, given the time never exists on set. There's never enough to record anything. But if I hear a strange sound or if we're in an interesting location, I'll try to just put a mic over there and record it when there's a bit of quiet or have my boom operator walk really far away from set to try to grab something interesting that might not be able to be recreated in post production. So I never know if that makes it in there, but knowing that I'm giving everything I can to the folks in post to build the soundscape, that's kind of the goal I set for myself. My little stamp, I guess.
Yeah, totally. That makes perfect sense. And I'm sure it is that much more satisfying when, like you said, it is out of your hands, but when you watch a final edit and you're like, oh, they did, include that thing that I recorded, or they, like, that was able to flow as well as it did because I provided them with the dialogue that I did. So, yeah, that makes total sense to me. Um, we're about wrapping up here, but I actually did want to just ask everybody one more kind of a fun question, I guess, is there anything that you've seen lately, maybe it can be your own work, it could be, another person's work, where you maybe just felt that these elements were functioning very well? Like when I ask about a great score or a great combination of sound and score, does anything come to mind? It could be a recent release. It could be Ben mentioned A Matter of Life and Death, which is a classic, So I'm curious if any projects come to mind. Just a fun question. No pressure on this one.
I have what got me into sound.
Yeah,
Um,
please share. I would love to hear.
that was, I mean, I was in film school at the time, and I saw Children of Men in the theater. And there's that scene where they're in the forest and the car's driving through, and a gunshot hits the windshield of the car, and you just hear the crack like move its way across the screen, the windscreen, as well as the screen in the theater. And that was the first time I'd ever noticed something like that, and realized the power that that had. And I was like, oh man, that's something I want to do. I didn't get into the post side, but the other side, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Great films. I'm not shocked that inspired you. That's really cool.
I mean, yeah, I suppose on a similar story, the getting into it is at the age of 9. I was taken to see Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and the I think the thing is that when at the end you've got all the spaceships flying about and the music going on, that the orchestra becomes the voice of the spaceships, and like the first things that they start responding. And of course, as a 9-year-old kid, that totally freaked me out. And even to this day, the hairs on the back of my head just go, it's like bananas when just at that moment, because the orchestra has entered the film and is the voice of these magical things. And I took my whole family to go and see it, a couple of years ago, thinking this is going to be a disaster. But actually, no, this magic was still there, and I think everyone gets that the music and the film, they're so intertwined. And it's like also in the I think it's a few dollars more. The little pocket watch and little tune plays on the pocket watch thing as they're all standing the three, and then the orchestra takes it over. And again, so those sort of moments just sort of that's why I got into it. Um, yeah, it's interesting about now. I'm going to think about what I've seen recently. I mean, the Formula One I thought was particularly, or F1 was particularly accomplished in its whole way. It did the sound and music and everything sort of away, sort of. But then I believe they had several years to line that one up. So, but it was that was probably the thing that struck me is the way that everything sort of seemed to work in harmony, and actually the authenticity of what they'd worked on with the cars, with everything else going on. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. I know those car and driving films always really tend to impress from a sound standpoint. I remember Ford versus Ferrari was a huge hit for that reason. So yeah, maybe Armand, maybe you were onto something by including those reversing truck sounds. I feel like something about the human brain, we just love that. Can you think of it could be again like on a film that fused these elements really well, or even just like a great score you've heard lately that comes to mind?
Yeah, yeah. Kind of like what some of the other panelists were saying, like what got me into sort of was like the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I feel like such an amazing job of including sound and music, and there those elements are keeping head to head with the story and everything. And a more recent example would be like Oppenheimer. I mean, I love all of Christopher Nolan's films, but especially with that one, like both the score and all the sounds super intricate, and you kind of feel it, and everything sits in the right place, and it hits you when it's supposed to hit you.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was definitely a film that came to mind when you all were talking earlier about this relationship between score and silence.
Hmm.
When the score drops out in that film, because it is such a beautiful score, it's that much more powerful. So yeah, that's a great choice as well. Philip, bring us home. Any projects that come to mind?
I'm just thinking, I've been watching the latest Stranger Things uh, Netflix show, and I think that's a really good example of sort of bringing sound design and music together. I mean, that's really a heavy, there's a lot of sound design in that, and they do give it sort of space to breathe. There was a scene I was watching the night, which was when we were talking about not overusing music, and it's sort of like a scene where some creature's attacking somebody, and it's like 30 years ago, you'd have had a big dramatic beating drums and score over that, but that they actually just stopped the music and it was purely the action with the sound design and no music at all. And I thought, and it stood out because it worked really well because you sort of would expect music on that bit, but they didn't have it. And also the way that sort of that they blended in a lot of 80s hits into that, and that works quite well. But blending between the sort of that very much analog synth score to those 80s tracks and a very sort of focused sound design in that series as well. So that would be my example.
Yeah, that's
Or
that's
I
a great
think it's
choice. I still got to catch up on this final season. That's what the holidays are going to be for
oh,
me.
that's
But
good.
that's
Yeah.
a show that I know is its relationship with music is so strong. Obviously, it kind of like I'm trying to incorporate a lot of '80s needle drops and whatnot. So it's even cooler to hear that there's a moment that stands out. That's sort of the inverse of what it's maybe known for. So I have to keep an ear out for that one for sure. Well, thank you all. This has been a lot of fun today. That's just about all the time that we have. But I want to thank you all again, Allison, Philip, Armand, Ben. It's been a lot of fun having you all here today. Just appreciate you discussing your work and kind of your maybe broader creative philosophy as it relates to both music and sound. Thank you to Impact 24 PR for putting this panel together, and everybody for watching. We'll see you all soon. I'm Corey Stoneman. Goodbye.